Right now, while you're watching this, somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a tanker the size of a city block is crawling through a strip of water so narrow you could theoretically cover its width on a clear day with nothing but your eyes. 20% of the world's oil moves through that strip, a quarter of all seaborne petroleum. Enough energy to keep hospitals running, factories humming, and supermarket shelves stocked across Asia, Europe, and North America. And the entire system, the entire fragile architecture of modern civilization's energy supply, squeezes through a gap barely wider than the distance from Manhattan to New Jersey. That's the Strait of Hormuz. And right now, American aircraft carriers are parked at its mouth. The thing nobody mentions in the news coverage is this: the standoff you're watching unfold in real time, a great power sending warships to control that narrow passage, a regional force threatening to shut it down, the whole world holding its breath, has played out before. Not once, not twice, dozens of times across 5 centuries in almost the same water. The faces change, the weapons change. The logic never does, because geography never does. That strip of water is still the same strip of water. The island sitting in the middle of it is still the same island. And that island has a story that will genuinely rearrange how you think about power, money, and the world you live in. We're talking about Hormuz, a tiny, alien-looking speck of volcanic rock and red soil in the Persian Gulf. An island so barren it doesn't grow its own food, so dry it has to import fresh water from the mainland. A place that by every logical measure should be nothing. A geographic footnote, a fishing village. Instead, for centuries, it was the most important dot on the map of the known world.
If you're interested in history and the parallels it draws, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a like. This is where you'll learn the stuff they don't talk about openly. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious.
Merchants from Venice and Cairo, from Beijing and Bengal, from Zanzibar and Samarkand, they all passed through Hormuz.
Persian silks, Indian pepper, Arabian horses, Chinese porcelain, African ivory, Sri Lankan rubies. None of it moved from east to west without bowing to whoever held that island. A Persian proverb said it plainly: if the whole world were a golden ring, Hormuz would be the jewel set in it. Marco Polo stopped there. Zheng He's treasure fleet anchored there. A Russian traveler named Afanasy Nikitin, crossing into Persia in the late 1400s, wrote home in astonishment. And then the Portuguese showed up with cannons and changed everything. And then the Persians took it back. And now American warships are doing essentially what the Portuguese did 5 centuries ago, projecting force into that same corridor, trying to control who gets to use the water and on whose terms. The names of the players have changed. The dollars involved have added several zeros, but the logic is identical. This is the story of the island that has been at the center of the world's most important power struggle for the better part of 1,000 years. And once you understand it, once you see why this patch of barren rock commands such terrifying leverage over everyone who needs it, you'll never look at a gas pump or a news headline about Iran the same way again. Picture a world where every spice in your kitchen is worth more than silver. Not metaphorically, literally. In medieval Europe, a pound of black pepper, the stuff you shake onto scrambled eggs without thinking about it, could pay a laborer's wages for a week. Cinnamon was so precious, it was listed in wills alongside land and jewelry. Nutmeg was rumored to cure the plague, which meant, in the middle of the Black Death, people were paying fortunes for it. Cloves, ginger, cardamom. These weren't flavors. They were currency. They were status symbols. They were medicine. They were the oil of the medieval world. And none of them grew anywhere near Europe. They grew in India, in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, in the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, a chain of volcanic peaks in what is now Indonesia, so remote that most Europeans had no idea they even existed. The spices had to travel thousands of miles across open ocean, through the monsoon winds of the Arabian Sea, up through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, across land by camel caravan, through a dozen middlemen, before they finally arrived in Venice or Genoa, smelling of faraway places that most buyers would never see. Every single step of that journey cost money. Every port took a cut. Every middleman added a markup. By the time a bag of pepper arrived in a market in Florence, it had changed hands perhaps 20 times, and its price had multiplied accordingly. The people who controlled the choke points along that route, the narrow passages, the mandatory stops, the unavoidable harbors, those people collected the tolls. And the single most unavoidable stop, the geographic bottleneck that no ship sailing between India and the Persian world could bypass, was a small island sitting in the mouth of the Persian Gulf. The island didn't start famous. It started useful. In the early centuries of the first millennium, what is now the island of Hormuz was barely inhabited. A strip of volcanic rock and salt flat, baking under a sun so punishing that Afanasy Nikitin, who had crossed the steppes of Russia and the mountains of Persia, described the heat there as something that could literally kill a man. "Great is the heat of the sun in Hormuz," he wrote. "It burns a person." No agriculture was possible.
Fresh water didn't exist on the island. Whatever civilization was going to rise there had to import literally everything it needed to survive, which meant it had to be worth someone's trouble to keep supplying. What made it worth the trouble was position. The Persian Gulf is essentially a long, narrow trough of warm water, pointing like an accusing finger toward the Indian Ocean. Everything that goes in or out, every ship sailing from Basra or Bandar Abbas toward India or Africa or Arabia, has to pass through its mouth. At that mouth sits the island of Hormuz, like a cork in a bottle. You don't need to be powerful everywhere. You just need to be present there. The Arab merchant kings who first understood this geometry built something remarkable around it. Starting around the 11th century, a dynasty of rulers based on the Iranian coast began expanding their influence across the Gulf entrance, controlling the islands, dominating the shipping lanes, extracting tribute from every vessel that needed to pass. Their state had no great army, no vast hinterland, no agricultural surplus. What it had was position, pure geographic leverage, deployed with ruthless commercial intelligence. By the time the ruler Bahauddin Ayaz made the fateful decision around the year 1300 to relocate his capital from the vulnerable mainland to the island itself, the transformation was complete. Old Hormuz, the mainland city that had been raided and plundered by Mongol armies sweeping through Persia, was abandoned. New Hormuz rose on the island, surrounded by water on all sides, defensible by sea in a way no city on a flat coast could be. And the moment that fortress city took root on that volcanic rock, the world's merchants started routing their journeys through it. What happened next was the medieval equivalent of a global logistics hub becoming the world's most important airport. Every trade route that mattered converged here. Ships from Calicut on the Malabar coast, India's great pepper and spice emporium, docked at Hormuz with their holds full of pepper, ginger, indigo, and cotton. Ships from Gujarat brought fine textiles, colorful dyes, and craftwork. Ships from East Africa brought ivory, gold dust, and enslaved people. Ships from China brought porcelain so delicate it rang when you tapped it, and silk so fine it could be folded into a pocket. From the Persian interior came the goods of the land empire. The famous horses of Arabia and Persia, worth fortunes in India where cavalry was the backbone of every sultanate's military power. Carpets woven in Tabriz and Herat, with patterns so complex they took years to make. Copper vessels from Kashan, saffron and rosewater and precious metalwork from Isfahan. All of it flowed through Hormuz. All of it paid the toll. The customs duty was fixed at 1/10 of everything. A tenth of every cargo that passed through the harbor went to the rulers of Hormuz. Not half, not a quarter, just a tenth. Which sounds almost generous until you realize the volume of trade passing through that harbor made even a tenth into an almost incomprehensible fortune. The city that rose on that barren, waterless rock became, in the words of the Arab geographer Abd al-Razak, something with no equal on the face of the earth. He described merchants arriving from Egypt and Anatolia, from Iraq and Iran, from Central Asia and Samarkand, from China and Bengal and the Malabar coast, merchants from the Golden Horde, merchants from Byzantium. He wrote, "What was life like in this improbable city? Imagine standing in the harbor on a morning in, say, 1400. The air is already hot before sunrise, dry and dense, smelling of salt and something slightly sulfurous from the volcanic rock beneath your feet. The water in the harbor is turquoise, astonishingly clear, and it's absolutely packed with ships. Not a dozen ships, not 100, hundreds of vessels, from enormous, multi-masted Indian trading ships to sleek Arab dhows built from teak and coconut fiber rope, to smaller Persian coastal boats riding low in the water under their loads. The sounds are extraordinary. A dozen languages at once, the creak of wooden hulls, the sharp cries of merchants arguing over weights, the bells of camels unloading on the quays. The buildings are stone, many of them 3, 4, 5 stories high. Unusual for a merchant city of this era, but necessary when you have almost no flat land to build outward on. On the rooftops, awnings of linen stretched between poles to cut the merciless sun. Inside the markets, every luxury of the known world laid out within a few hundred yards of each other. Bolts of Chinese silk next to crates of African ivory, next to jars of Persian rosewater, next to stacks of spice sacks leaking their fragrance into the hot air. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler who saw more of the medieval world than almost any other human being alive, visited Hormuz and described it as a large and beautiful city with fine markets. The 14th century merchant Abd al-Razak went further. He described the city's women wearing long robes sewn with gold thread, their faces half veiled with fabric that shimmered in the desert light. And, crucially, the wealth was real. Not the theatrical wealth of a court city that existed to glorify a king. Actual commercial wealth, generated by real trade between real merchants from real distant places. The rulers of Hormuz were rich because merchants chose to stop there. And merchants chose to stop there because the infrastructure, the protection, the deep harbor, and the fair, if obligatory, customs system made it the best option for hundreds of miles in any direction. It was, in a very genuine sense, the world's first great free trade zone. Free in the sense that any merchant of any religion or origin could trade there, provided they paid the tenth. The Chinese knew it. In the early 1400s, the Ming Dynasty Emperor Yongle sent the eunuch admiral Zheng He on a series of extraordinary voyages across the Indian Ocean, with a fleet so enormous it wouldn't be matched in scale until the modern era. Hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of men, the largest naval expedition the world had ever seen. Zheng He's fleet came to Hormuz multiple times. The Ma Huan, a Muslim interpreter who sailed with the fleet and wrote a meticulous account of everywhere they stopped, described Hormuz in terms of wonder. The people, he noted, were fine and light-skinned. The clothes were long, elegant robes. The city was prosperous enough that even the poor lived comfortably. The Russians knew it too. Afanasy Nikitin, a merchant from Tver in central Russia, a man who had no business being in the Persian Gulf at all, but who spent 3 years wandering through Persia and India in the 1470s on a journey so improbable it reads like a fever dream, stopped at Hormuz on his way to India. He wrote about the tides, the extraordinary heat, the stunning variety of goods, the heavy customs duties. He was overwhelmed by it. The Venetians knew it. Venice's entire commercial empire, its glass, its spices, its wealth, its extraordinary art, its political influence across Europe, was built on controlling the western end of the same trade route that fed Hormuz at its eastern end. When Venetian merchants looked east toward the source of their wealth, the road led eventually to this island. Marco Polo visited Hormuz twice on his journeys to and from China and described it as a city rich with merchants from all over the known world. To understand why all of these people, Chinese admirals, Russian merchants, Venetian traders, Arab geographers, Persian poets, converged on this one spot, you have to understand something about the medieval world's relationship with geography. In an era before the railroad, before the highway, before the airplane, the sea was the only efficient way to move large quantities of goods across long distances. A single ship could carry what hundreds of camels could carry, at a fraction of the cost and in a fraction of the time. And the sea routes that connected the great civilizations of Eurasia and Africa all funneled, through a series of geographic constraints, monsoon patterns, and coastal configurations, through a small number of unavoidable points. Hormuz was the most critical of these in the Indian Ocean world. Not one option among many. The option. The rulers of Hormuz understood this. They didn't try to build an empire in the conventional sense. No vast land armies, no territorial conquests across hundreds of miles. They didn't need to. Their empire was the sea route itself. Control the island, maintain the harbor, keep the merchant peace, and the world would come to you. And for roughly 3 centuries, from the early 1300s to the early 1500s, that strategy worked with almost perfect consistency. The kingdom paid tribute to the Persian Shahs when it had to. Nominally, it was a vassal of whoever happened to be ruling the Iranian plateau at any given moment, but in practice, the rulers of Hormuz operated with nearly complete autonomy. They built alliances with Indian princes, with Arab sheikhs, with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt who controlled the Red Sea's western end. They hired mercenaries from across the Gulf world. They maintained a navy of small, fast vessels that could enforce their customs laws with sufficient menace to keep most merchants honest. They were, in the most literal sense, the masters of the toll road at the center of the world. And then, one September morning in 1507, a Portuguese fleet appeared on the horizon. 6 ships, maybe 7. The city's vizier reportedly looked at the fleet and saw nothing worth worrying about. What could a handful of European ships do against a city of tens of thousands, backed by hundreds of vessels, and a garrison hardened by decades of enforcing its will across the Gulf? The answer, when dawn broke over that harbor, would shock the entire Islamic world, from Cairo to Calicut. The cannon fired at dawn. Not a warning shot, not a demonstration. The first shot from Afonso de Albuquerque's flagship was aimed directly at the harbor master's boat, a vessel that had rowed out to meet the Portuguese fleet with the entirely reasonable expectation of collecting customs fees from yet another set of foreign traders. One moment the boat was there, cutting through the turquoise water in the early light. The next moment there was smoke, and a sound like the sky tearing open, and the boat was gone. That sound, a rolling, chest-collapsing thunderclap that bounced off the stone walls of the city and echoed back across the harbor, was a sound that no one standing on the quays of Hormuz had ever heard before. The Arab dhows and Indian trading ships had cannons of a kind, small swivel guns and anti-personnel weapons that could clear a deck at close range. But what Albuquerque had brought into this harbor was something qualitatively different. Heavy bronze breech-loading artillery, the product of decades of Portuguese investment in the science of destroying things from a distance. These weren't weapons. They were an argument, and Albuquerque was making it at the top of his voice. The city that watched from the shore had never needed this kind of argument aimed at it before. Hormuz had always been too valuable to destroy. You didn't sack a city that made you rich. You taxed it, traded with it, formed alliances with it, occasionally threatened it. The entire logic of Hormuz as a power was commercial, not military. Its rulers had survived for 2 centuries by being indispensable. Nobody kills the golden goose. Albuquerque had a different philosophy entirely. He understood something that the merchants of Hormuz and the Venetians and Arabs who had grown wealthy in the same system had never had to reckon with. The Indian Ocean trade was the richest commercial network in the world, but it was only accessible if you already had a ship and could find the route. The Portuguese, after 60 years of coastal exploration down the length of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope and up through the Indian Ocean, had found the back door. They had arrived in the Indian Ocean from the south, bypassing the entire chain of Muslim middlemen that controlled the routes through Egypt and the Persian Gulf. And Albuquerque's insight, brutal, clear-eyed, and ahead of its time, was that the only way to make that back door permanently profitable was to own the network's unavoidable passages. Not trade through them, own them. He wanted Hormuz not for its markets. He wanted it for its position. The vizier of Hormuz, a man named Khwaja Atta, ordered his fleet to attack. Over 100 vessels moved against the Portuguese ships in the harbor. Albuquerque let them come. The carnage that followed lasted hours. Portuguese cannons fired into the packed mass of attacking vessels at ranges where they could hardly miss. Arab and Indian sailors, fighting with courage on ships built for commerce rather than war, were cut down by iron shot moving faster than anything they had a word for. A dhow that caught a cannonball below the waterline didn't sink gracefully. It came apart, sending men into the water surrounded by splinters the size of spears. The harbor, which had spent centuries accumulating the sweet smell of spices and the excited noise of commerce, filled with smoke and screaming. By mid-morning, the attack was broken. By afternoon, Khwaja Atta had sent envoys to negotiate. By the following week, the Kingdom of Hormuz had agreed to become a tributary of the Portuguese crown. To pay tribute, to fly the Portuguese flag from its towers, to grant the newcomers trading rights that amounted to commercial dominance. Albuquerque had taken the most important port in the world, with fewer than 500 men, and in less than a day. The man who pulled this off had a beard that people would still be talking about decades after his death. Afonso de Albuquerque was in his mid-50s, old for someone who had spent his adult life fighting at the edge of the known world, and he had arrived at Hormuz without orders, without permission, and almost without supplies. His ships were battered. His men were sick. By any rational military calculation, he should have turned around and waited for reinforcements from Lisbon. Instead, he had walked into the most powerful trading city on Earth and burned its navy in its own harbor. Not because he was reckless, because he understood that hesitation in a moment like this was its own kind of defeat. The world's great choke points don't wait for the well-prepared. They belong to whoever arrives first with enough violence to make the claims stick. But here is where the story refuses to follow the arc you expect. Hormuz didn't die. The kingdom didn't collapse. The merchants didn't scatter. The networks didn't dissolve. Because what Albuquerque had shattered was only the visible surface of the city's power. The harbor master, the customs boats, the official fleet. What he had not touched, and what he perhaps never fully understood existed, were the invisible structures that had made the city function for 2 centuries. The relationship networks, the credit lines, the loyalty chains, the informal agreements between merchants from a dozen different cultures who kept the whole system running because they needed it to run. Consider who actually made Hormuz work. Not the king and his vizier. Those were the political layer, the face the city turned toward power. Below that was a commercial layer of extraordinary complexity. Indian merchant guilds that maintained warehouses and credit networks stretching from Calicut to Cairo. Persian broker families who spoke 6 languages and held letters of credit honored from Tabriz to Zanzibar. Arab dhow captains who carried no written cargo manifests because the entire system ran on personal reputation and multi-generational trust. Jewish traders who maintained links with the Mediterranean world that neither Muslim nor Hindu merchants could easily access. Armenian merchants who served as intermediaries between the Iranian interior and the sea. Each group had its own internal hierarchy, its own dispute resolution systems, its own mechanisms for ensuring that a merchant from Bengal could trust a merchant from Oman enough to hand him a fortune in silk and wait months for payment. This wasn't a market. It was a living organism made of human relationships, and it had been growing and adapting for 2 centuries. You can sink a dhow with a cannonball. You cannot sink a trust network with a cannonball. So what happened after Albuquerque's guns went cold was this. The Portuguese took formal control of Hormuz, built a fort on the island, stationed a garrison, flew their flag, and extracted their tribute. And simultaneously, the merchants of Hormuz kept trading. They routed certain cargoes through the Red Sea instead of the Gulf, creating alternative channels that the Portuguese couldn't easily monitor. They developed systems for underreporting cargo values to minimize customs payments. They maintained commercial alliances with powers, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, various Indian princes, the Ottoman Empire after it absorbed Egypt in 1517, that had every reason to undermine Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. The kingdom became a Portuguese tributary on paper. In practice, it remained what it had always been, a commercial ecosystem so deeply rooted, so functionally necessary to everyone who used it, that even the people who claimed to own it couldn't afford to destroy it. This produced something genuinely strange, a colonial relationship in which the colonizer was, in some meaningful sense, dependent on the colonized. The Portuguese needed Hormuz's merchants to keep trading. Without the trade, the island was just a hot rock in the Gulf with a very expensive garrison. And the merchants knew this. They didn't rebel openly. Open rebellion would have been crushed. Instead, they made themselves indispensable while quietly preserving the autonomy of their networks. They cooperated fully in every visible, checkable way, and maintained their independence in every invisible, uncheckable way. It was a survival strategy as old as commerce itself, and it worked. Now feel the weight of what was actually being fought over through all this blood and smoke and negotiation. A single bolt of Chinese silk, the finest stuff, woven in the workshops of Suzhou, thin and lustrous, catching light the way moving water does, would change hands perhaps a dozen times between the Chinese merchant who commissioned it and the European nobleman who eventually wore it. At each handover, it accumulated value, traveled in the holds of ships that could be sunk by storms or pirates, was stored in warehouses that could catch fire, was carried by camelback across deserts, was inspected by customs agents operating under 3 or 4 different legal systems. Every step of this journey was a risk. Every risk had to be compensated. By the time that silk arrived in Lisbon or Venice, it carried within its price the accumulated terror of every leg of its journey. The spices were worse. Black pepper grew on vines in the wet forests of Kerala, thousands of miles from the nearest European market. It had to be harvested, dried, bagged, loaded, shipped across the Arabian Sea, unloaded, inspected, reshipped, taxed, carried by land, taxed again, and shipped a second time before it reached your kitchen. And pepper was the common one, the affordable luxury. Nutmeg grew only on a handful of tiny islands in the Banda Sea, so remote that for centuries Europeans weren't certain they existed. A single sack of nutmeg represented a journey of 10,000 miles across some of the most dangerous water on Earth. This is what made the strait so ferociously contested. Not just strategic position, but the staggering value of everything flowing through it. Silk, spice, porcelain, fine horses, dyed cotton, precious stones. These were the luxury goods of a world that ran on luxury goods, the way our world runs on oil. And whoever sat at the passage, whoever controlled the entry and exit, collected a premium on every single item in every single category. The Portuguese discovered, in the decades after Albuquerque's triumph, that controlling Hormuz was like owning a toll road that everyone needs but nobody likes. The income was real and enormous. The cost of maintaining control, the garrison, the ships, the constant low-level violence required to enforce compliance, was also real and enormous. And the enemies multiplied. Every power that had profited from the old system before the Portuguese arrived had reasons to want them gone. The Ottoman Empire, expanding aggressively through the Middle East after 1517, moved to establish its own presence in the Persian Gulf. The Safavid Persians, who had lost face when Hormuz nominally transferred its loyalty to Lisbon, watched and waited. Indian merchant powers that had lost their preferred status under the new regime looked for openings. The Portuguese held Hormuz for 110 years, a remarkable achievement and a permanently exhausting one. Their garrison was never quite large enough, their supply lines never quite secure enough, their intelligence on local political shifts never quite reliable enough. They won battle after battle. They never won the peace. And then, in 1622, Shah Abbas the Great of Persia made his move. He had spent decades building his new Persian Empire's commercial infrastructure, constructing the port city of Bandar Abbas on the mainland directly across from the island. He needed naval power to take on the Portuguese fleet, which he didn't have. What he did have was something the Portuguese wanted desperately: access to Persian trade, Persian silk, Persian luxury goods that European markets hungered for. So he offered the English East India Company a deal. Help me take the island. I'll give you trading rights no European power has ever held in Persia. The English calculated the math in about 10 minutes and said yes. It was the kind of alliance that forms not out of trust or affection, but out of perfectly aligned self-interest. And those are almost always the most effective alliances. The Portuguese garrison on Hormuz, badly supplied and politically abandoned by a Lisbon consumed with other crises, fell in a matter of weeks. The island that Albuquerque had seized so dramatically a century before slipped out of European hands almost without a fight. The city was sacked. The harbor infrastructure was deliberately, strategically dismantled, because Shah Abbas didn't want to revive Hormuz as an independent power. He wanted its trade rerouted to Bandar Abbas, his city, on his coast, under his control. It worked. Hormuz the city crumbled into the silence it holds today. Those red volcanic ruins, the Portuguese fort's bleached walls still standing in the heat, the memory of silk and spice and the sound of 1,000 ships' cargoes drifting over empty stone. But the strait kept its name, and the strait kept its power. Because geographic leverage doesn't care who holds it. It doesn't care what century it is. It doesn't care whether the ships running through it are dhows carrying pepper or supertankers carrying crude. The Persian Gulf still funnels to a single exit point. That exit point is still the most consequential 21 miles of water on the planet. The Portuguese understood this in 1507 when they pointed their cannons at a harbor master's boat. And on a warship somewhere in those same waters tonight,
the lesson is being learned all over again. The radar screen glows green in the dark. Not metaphorically green. Literally, physically green. That specific cold luminescence of military-grade maritime surveillance equipment. The kind that turns every operator's face the color of old money. What the operator sees on that screen right now, in the strait between Iran and Oman, is a traffic jam that would make the Los Angeles freeway system look peaceful. Tankers. Dozens of them. Some so enormous they take up a visible footprint on the display. Vessels that, if you stood them on end, would overtop the Empire State Building. Moving in convoy lanes that are, by international agreement, only 2 miles wide in each direction. 4 miles of sanctioned navigation corridor total, in a strait that, at its narrowest, is barely 21 miles across. The rest of that water is too shallow, too rocky, or too politically charged to use. So everything squeezes through. The oil that heats homes in Japan, the liquefied natural gas that keeps European factories running, the petroleum products that stock every gas station from Seoul to Stuttgart, all of it crawling at roughly 15 miles per hour through a corridor you could theoretically kayak across in a long afternoon. The operator also sees other contacts on that screen. Smaller, faster, moving in patterns that don't match commercial shipping. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps patrol boats. Quick, armed, operating under a doctrine that calls for swarm tactics against large, slow targets in confined waterways. A fleet of speedboats moving toward a supertanker in a narrow channel is not an abstraction. It is a very specific, very high-stakes problem. One that American destroyers running counter-patrol in the same water exist to solve, or that, in the worst version of events, nobody solves in time. This is what the Strait of Hormuz looks like at 3 in the morning on any given night. Not a crisis. Not yet. Just the permanent, exhausting, unblinking tension that the world's most important waterway generates every single hour it remains open. The operator drinks cold coffee, watches the contacts, notes positions, waits. Waiting here has a long history, and the political pressure bearing down on those 21 miles right now carries the unmistakable shape of something that has happened before. Donald Trump returned to the White House with a theory about Iran that is, at its core, the same theory Albuquerque carried into the harbor of Hormuz. That overwhelming force projection, economic in Trump's case, naval in Albuquerque's, compels accommodation. The strategy is called maximum pressure. Sanctions so severe, so comprehensive, so relentlessly enforced that the target government faces a binary choice: negotiate on American terms or watch its economy disintegrate. Trump's first term applied this logic after withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. Sanctions were reimposed. Iranian oil exports collapsed. The rial lost most of its value. Ordinary Iranians suffered, genuinely and extensively. What the theory predicted was capitulation. What happened instead was something more uncomfortable. Iran's government used the economic pain as political cover to accelerate the very nuclear program the pressure was designed to freeze. The logic on the Iranian side, particularly among the Revolutionary Guard Corps factions that actually drive security policy, runs like this. Confrontation with America is the source of our institutional legitimacy, not a problem to be solved. Pressure from Washington doesn't weaken that argument internally, it strengthens it. Every sanction becomes evidence for the worldview that survival requires defiance. This is the same dynamic Albuquerque encountered after taking Hormuz. He applied overwhelming force. The visible structures of resistance crumbled immediately. But the deeper networks, the ones that actually kept the city functioning, the ones that preserved its commercial autonomy and its capacity for resistance, those networks absorbed the blow and reorganized. The Portuguese won the battle.
and spent a century fighting the aftermath. Trump's fleet in the Gulf today is the modern version of that Portuguese garrison. Enormously powerful, genuinely capable of inflicting devastating damage, and facing the same structural problem that made the Portuguese century in Hormuz an exercise in expensive, exhausting, never quite finished dominance. Military presence at a choke point controls the water. It does not control the will of the people on the shore. The stakes of this standoff have a physical reality that becomes clear the moment you trace what actually happens if the strait closes, even briefly, even partially. Not a total blockade, not a war, just a serious, credible threat that lasts long enough for insurance markets to reprice the risk. In 2019, during Trump's first term, a series of tanker attacks in the Gulf of Oman, attributed to Iranian forces, sent shipping insurance premiums spiking without a single major vessel being sunk. No lanes were permanently closed. The physical damage was real but limited. And yet, the signal moved through the global financial system like voltage through a wire, touching every economy connected to that oil supply. Gasoline prices in Ohio shifted. Airline quarterly earnings reports moved. The invisible thread connecting that radar screen to a gas station in Cincinnati turned out to be brutally, uncomfortably short. This is the leverage Iran holds, and the reason that American carrier strike groups must remain in the region regardless of which administration holds the White House. Not to conquer, not even primarily to deter a nuclear strike, but to keep that 21-mile corridor open every single hour of every single day, because the global economy has been engineered around the assumption that it will be. Close it for a week, and the ripple effects reach every grocery store, every hospital supply chain, every manufacturing floor that runs on petroleum products. The world didn't choose this vulnerability consciously. It accumulated it over decades, the way water carves a canyon, slowly, invisibly, until one day you look down and realize how deep the cut runs. The Portuguese crown understood this dynamic in their own terms. Hormuz was the jewel of their Indian Ocean empire because the trade that flowed through it was the financial engine of everything else they were trying to do. In Africa, in Brazil, in the Spice Islands of Asia. But maintaining the jewel required a perpetual garrison, a perpetual fleet, a perpetual drain on Portuguese military and financial resources that never quite ended. They won control in 1507. 110 years later, one bad alliance and one undersupplied garrison, and the whole thing was gone in weeks. The parallel isn't comfortable, but it is precise. And there is another force in this picture now that has no clean historical equivalent, yet slots into the old pattern with unsettling ease. China has signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Iran. Chinese companies buy Iranian oil at heavily discounted prices, giving Tehran a revenue stream that cushions the blow of American sanctions. Chinese infrastructure investment is moving through the region. Ports, roads, digital networks, financial systems designed to route transactions outside the dollar-dominated architecture that makes American sanctions effective in the first place. Beijing is not threatening to close the strait. It doesn't need to. It is methodically constructing an alternative world in which the strait's closure would hurt America and its allies far more than it would hurt China and its partners. This is not aggression in the traditional sense. It is something more patient, and in some ways more dangerous. The deliberate erosion of the dependency structures that make American naval dominance valuable. If the global economy reorganizes itself so that the critical flows no longer move exclusively through dollar-denominated trade, through Western-insured shipping, through the logistics architecture that American power underwrites, then parking aircraft carriers at Hormuz becomes an increasingly expensive performance rather than a decisive strategic asset. The Safavid Shah Abbas understood this logic intuitively in the early 1600s. He didn't try to defeat the Portuguese navy directly. He built Bandar Abbas. He rerouted the trade. He made Hormuz, the island, irrelevant by making the strait, the water, flow toward his city instead of theirs. What China is doing in the 21st century is structurally similar. Not a frontal challenge to American military power, but a patient re-architecting of the economic system that military power is protecting. Empires rarely end with a single dramatic defeat. They end when the thing they were protecting stops being worth the cost of protection. The Portuguese didn't leave Hormuz because they were beaten in a climactic battle. They left because the world had reorganized around their position, and they had never converted a century of choke point control into the kind of deep structural advantage that could survive a determined coalition. The English and the Persians who took the island from them in 1622 weren't stronger in any simple military sense. They were better positioned in the geometry that had been quietly assembling around the Portuguese for decades. That geometry is assembling again, in different water, with different instruments, at a scale that would have been incomprehensible to Albuquerque or Shah Abbas. But the underlying logic, who controls the passage, who controls the alternatives, who controls the system within which the passage operates, is the same logic it has always been. There is a man who lives on the island of Hormuz today. His name is Hassan. He is in his 60s, weathered in the specific way of people who have spent their lives under a sun that treats everything, skin, stone, ambition, with equal indifference. He runs a small tea shop near the old Portuguese fort, where the bleached coral stone walls still stand after 5 centuries of salt wind and Gulf heat, the cannon emplacements empty, the harbormaster's office a ruin open to the sky. On some mornings, when the wind is coming off the water and the air smells of brine and something faintly mineral from the red volcanic soil, Hassan sits outside with his glass of tea and looks at the strait. The water is still turquoise, still astonishingly clear in the shallows near shore. And if you ask him about the history, about the merchants and the fleets and the silk and the Portuguese cannons, he will tell you, without particular drama, that all of it happened right here. Not far from here, not approximately here. Here, on this red soil, in this specific water. Kings came to this island, he will say. The whole world came here. Then he will drink his tea and watch a supertanker the size of a small town slide silently through the gap between his island and the Iranian coast, carrying its cargo toward a world that needs it desperately and understands almost nothing of what was paid across 5 centuries of blood and silk and smoke to keep that water open. The tanker doesn't slow down. It never does. It just moves through the dark, the way everything has always moved through this water, urgently, carefully, watched by people on both shores who understand exactly what it carries and exactly what it means. The radar screen on the warship to the south catches its outline and marks it. Friendly, commercial, transiting. Another contact in a corridor that has never, in 1,000 years, gone quiet. Not under Arab merchant kings, not under Portuguese cannons, not under Persian shahs, not under American carrier groups. The strait that has no name without the island that has no meaning without the strait, and the water between them, that narrow, impossibly consequential ribbon of blue, flowing on as it has always flowed, indifferent to whoever believes.